A house shouldn't feel this empty when someone just stepped out for a moment. Helen Anderson learned this truth at 4:17 in the morning on March 9, 2021, when she reached across cold sheets and found nothing but absence. The bedroom of their Manly home still held the scent of Robert's cologne from the night before, a woodsy aftershave he'd worn for their entire 19 years of marriage. The digital clock cast its pale blue glow across the pillow where his head should have been resting. She lay there for several minutes, listening to the silence, telling herself he'd probably gone downstairs for water or stepped outside to check something in the garage. Robert had always been a light sleeper, especially between contracts when his mind struggled to adjust from the constant motion of the ocean to the stillness of suburban life. But the silence felt wrong. It had texture and weight, pressing down on her chest as she finally pushed back the duvet and walked barefoot across the hardwood floor. The hallway was dark except for the faint glow of the nightlight outside their daughter's rooms. Emma's door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap Helen could see her 17-year-old daughter curled beneath her blankets, phone still clutched in one hand, even in sleep. Sophie's room was darker. The 14-year-old sprawled across her bed in the careless way only teenagers can manage. Everything appeared normal, untouched by whatever had pulled Robert from their bed in the middle of the night. The stairs creaked under Helen's weight as she descended toward the ground floor. She called his name softly, not wanting to wake the girls, but received no answer. The living room was empty, the kitchen undisturbed. Their wedding photo still hung on the wall near the refrigerator. 20 years younger versions of themselves smiling on a beach in Cairns. She checked the garage through the side door and found his Holden Commodore missing from its usual spot, the oil stain on the concrete floor marking where it should have been. That's when she noticed the back door. It stood open perhaps 6 inches, letting in the cool March air and the distant sound of waves breaking against the shore 2 blocks away. Helen approached it slowly, her bare feet suddenly cold against the tiles. The door wasn't damaged. The lock hadn't been forced. She distinctly remembered Robert checking all the doors before they went to bed. A ritual he performed religiously, after every homecoming, as if the months spent securing a massive cruise ship had programmed him to secure their modest suburban house with the same vigilance. She stepped outside into the small backyard, the grass wet with dew beneath her feet. The motion sensor light flickered on, illuminating the empty patio furniture and the lemon tree Robert had planted the previous spring. Nothing appeared disturbed. No overturned chairs, no signs of struggle. Just the open door and the missing car and the terrible expanding silence that seemed to swallow her voice when she called his name again, louder this time. Helen went back inside and checked her phone. No messages, no missed calls. She tried Robert's number and heard it ring through to voicemail, his familiar voice asking her to leave a message. She hung up without speaking and tried again. Still voicemail. At 4:43 she called their closest neighbors, the Mitchells, but got no answer. At 4:57 she called Robert's brother in Brisbane, waking him, her voice shaking as she tried to explain that something was wrong, that Robert had vanished in the night, that she didn't know what to do. By 5:30, as dawn began to pale the eastern sky, Helen sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of tea she couldn't bring herself to drink. She kept replaying the previous evening, searching for clues she might have missed. They'd had dinner together, all 4 of them. Spaghetti carbonara, Sophie's favorite. Robert had been quiet, but not unusually so. He'd helped Emma with her calculus homework after dinner, patient as always with her frustration over derivatives and integrals. They'd watched television for an hour, some reality show Helen couldn't even remember now. Then the phone had rung. Robert Anderson had spent 23 years turning massive vessels through narrow harbors and open seas, commanding crews of hundreds and ensuring the safety of thousands of passengers who trusted him with their vacations and sometimes their lives. The walls of his small home office told the story of that career in framed certificates and photographs. Robert at the helm during his first command in 2003, a smaller regional cruiser that ran routes between Sydney and the Whitsundays. Robert, shaking hands with the CEO of Maritime Voyages in 2011, after being promoted to captain of their flagship Pacific Explorer. Robert receiving a commendation for his handling of a medical emergency at sea in 2015, when he'd coordinated with Coast Guard helicopters to evacuate a passenger suffering a stroke 300 nautical miles from the nearest hospital. His colleagues, at Maritime Voyages headquarters in Circular Quay, described him as meticulous, almost to a fault. A man who reviewed weather patterns obsessively and conducted safety drills with a seriousness that sometimes annoyed his crew, but had never resulted in a single serious injury aboard any vessel under his command. James Webster, who'd served as Robert's first officer for 7 years, told investigators that the captain ran the tightest ship in the fleet, that he knew the name of every crew member under his authority, that he'd once delayed a departure by 40 minutes to ensure a young steward's appendicitis was properly diagnosed rather than dismissed as seasickness. The Anderson family lived modestly despite Robert's senior position. Their 3-bedroom house in Manly had been purchased in 2007, before the area's property values skyrocketed beyond the reach of most maritime workers. Helen worked part-time, as a primary school teacher's aide, a job that allowed her to be home when the girls finished school and gave her flexibility to manage the household during Robert's long absences at sea. His schedule meant he was gone for 6 to 8 weeks at a time, then home for 2 to 3 weeks between contracts. The rhythm of his departures and returns had shaped their entire family life, creating patterns of reunion and separation that Emma and Sophie had never known any differently. Financially, the Andersons were stable but not wealthy. Robert's salary was respectable, around $130,000 annually, but hardly extravagant for a man with his level of responsibility. Their mortgage was nearly paid off. They had modest savings and superannuation funds that would see them through retirement if Robert continued working until 65, as he'd always planned. There were no secret bank accounts, no unexplained withdrawals, no evidence of gambling debts or hidden vices. His credit card statements showed the mundane expenses of middle-class family life. Groceries, school fees, occasional dinners out, a weekend trip to the Blue Mountains the previous January. Helen told police that Robert had seemed more contemplative lately, quieter than usual during his most recent leave. But she'd attributed it to fatigue. The pandemic had created chaos in the cruise industry throughout 2020, with ships stranded. At sea, crew members quarantined far from home, passengers desperate to disembark. Maritime Voyages had suspended most operations for 8 months. Robert had spent that time doing administrative work from home, reviewing safety protocols and helping plan the company's eventual return to service. He'd only returned to sea in January 2021, commanding a reduced-capacity cruise with stringent health measures. The voyage had gone smoothly by all accounts, yet Helen sensed he'd returned home carrying some invisible weight he couldn't quite articulate. Emma remembered her father helping her with homework the night he disappeared, his patience never wavering, even when she grew frustrated with problems she couldn't solve. Sophie recalled him asking about her upcoming piano recital, promising he'd be there even though his next contract was scheduled to begin the week before. Both girls described a father who was present when home, who never raised his voice, who had taught them to sail in the harbor when they were young. Neither could think of anyone who might wish him harm. Robert Anderson had no enemies that his family knew of, no disputes with neighbors, no angry confrontations, no history of violence or aggression. He was, by every measure, available to those who loved him. A good man who'd simply vanished into the March night as if the ocean he'd spent his life navigating had finally reached up from the harbor and pulled him under. The phone call had lasted exactly 38 seconds. Detective Senior Constable Margaret Clark sat in the Anderson living room 3 days after Robert's disappearance, her laptop open on the coffee table, walking Helen through the telecommunications records that had taken 48 hours to obtain. The call had come in at 22:43 on March 8th, originating from a number that wasn't registered to any known subscriber. A burner phone, Clark explained, the kind you could purchase with cash at any convenience store, activated without identification. Impossible to trace back to a purchaser, unless security footage happened to capture the transaction. Helen sat with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long since gone cold. She told this story a dozen times already, to the first responding officers who'd arrived at 6 that morning, to the detectives who'd taken over the case by noon, to Robert's brother on the phone, to her parents, to Emma and Sophie when they'd asked why police cars were parked outside their house. Each retelling wore the memory thinner, like a photograph left too. Long in sunlight, but certain details remained sharp. Robert had been reading in bed beside her, a biography of Ernest Shackleton he'd been working through for weeks. The phone had rung, and he'd looked at the screen, his expression shifting in a way Helen couldn't quite categorize. Not fear exactly, recognition perhaps mixed with something else. Resignation. He'd answered without greeting whoever was calling, just pressed the phone to his ear and listened. Helen had heard nothing from the other end, no voice loud enough to penetrate the distance between them. Robert had said maybe 5 words total. She remembered yes and understood and something that might have been when, but she couldn't be certain. His voice had been flat, empty of inflection. After he'd hung up, he'd sat on the edge of the bed for almost a minute, the phone still in his hand, his back to her. She'd asked what was wrong, and he'd turned, kissed her forehead with a tenderness that now felt like goodbye, and said he needed to resolve something, that he'd be back soon, that she shouldn't worry. The phrase "shouldn't worry" had become a kind of torture in the 72 hours since. Helen found herself repeating it during the endless night hours when sleep became impossible, when she lay in their bed trying to reconstruct every detail of Robert's face in that final moment. Had his eyes been frightened, angry, determined? She couldn't be sure anymore. Memory was proving itself unreliable, shifting and reshaping itself with each replay, adding details that might not have been there, erasing others that certainly were. Detective Clark explained that they'd attempted to ping the phone that had called Robert, but it had been switched off within minutes of the call ending, and hadn't powered on since. A dead end in the most literal sense. They were checking security footage from stores within a 20-kilometer radius of Manly, looking for anyone purchasing prepaid phones in the days leading up to March 8th. But Clark's tone suggested she held little hope for this avenue of investigation. Tens of thousands of people lived in the Northern Beaches area. Hundreds of stores sold burner phones. The footage would take weeks to review and might reveal nothing useful. Emma sat on the stairs just out of sight, listening to the detective's measured voice explaining why they couldn't find her father. Sophie was at her grandmother's house, spared this particular conversation, but Emma had refused to leave. She was 17, old enough to hear the truth, she'd insisted. Old enough to understand that something terrible had happened, even if the adults wouldn't say it directly. She'd seen her mother's face when the police had first arrived. She'd watched the careful way the detectives moved through their house, photographing Robert's office, bagging his laptop and phone records, treating their home like a crime scene, even though no crime had visibly occurred. The number itself revealed nothing. It had been activated on March 7th at a mobile phone shop in Parramatta, 25 kilometers west of Manly. The shop's owner remembered selling several prepaid SIM cards that day, but couldn't recall any specific customers. Paid cash, he'd told police. Lots of people paid cash. There were no security cameras inside the shop. Only one pointed at the register that showed hands and torsos, but rarely faces. Detective Clark had shown Helen the footage anyway, asking if she recognized anyone, any distinctive jewelry or clothing or mannerisms. Helen had watched the grainy video 3 times, seeing nothing but strangers buying phone credit and SIM cards, their faces angled away from the camera as if they knew exactly where not to look. The Holden Commodore sat in Bay 17 of the Spit Bridge Marina parking area, unremarkable among dozens of other vehicles whose owners had taken boats out for early morning fishing or late-night maintenance work. A parking enforcement officer, named David Chen, had noticed it on the morning of March 10th during his routine patrol, tagged it as potentially abandoned by that afternoon when it still hadn't moved, and called it in to police by March 11th. When the registration came back, belonging to a Robert Anderson of Manly, currently listed as a missing person, Detective Clark had stood beside the vehicle for a long time before allowing the forensics team to approach it. The car was locked, properly parked within the lines, showing no signs of forced entry or struggle. She'd peered through the windows with her flashlight, even though it was mid-afternoon, the March sun bright overhead, illuminating the interior with cruel clarity. The front seats were empty except for a coffee cup in the holder, the dregs long since dried into a brown ring at the bottom. A navigation system mounted on the dashboard showed no recent destinations programmed. The back seat held a maritime safety manual and a folded newspaper from March 6th. Everything appeared ordinary, untouched, as if Robert had simply parked here intending to return shortly. The security footage from the marina told a different story, or rather told half a story, and left the rest shrouded in darkness and unanswered questions. The camera mounted at the entrance captured Robert's Commodore entering a 2317 on March 8th, less than 30 minutes after the mysterious phone call had pulled him from his bed. The timestamp glowed white in the corner of the frame as Robert drove past the barrier arm, his face briefly visible through the windscreen, expression unreadable in the grainy footage. He looked straight ahead, both hands on the wheel, driving with the careful precision that characterized everything he did. The camera, positioned near the main pier walkway, showed Robert parking in Bay 17, sitting in the car for approximately 4 minutes before emerging. The footage was frustratingly incomplete, the angle capturing only portions of his movements. He'd walked quickly toward the piers, hands in the pockets of the jacket he'd grabbed on his way out of the house. His gait suggested purpose rather than panic, a man who knew where he was going and why. The camera lost him as he moved deeper into the marina complex, toward the maze of piers where hundreds of boats rocked gently in their berths, their masts creating a forest of aluminum and fiberglass that blocked sightlines and created countless blind spots. No camera captured Robert leaving. The forensics team reviewed 48 hours of footage from every angle available, watching boats come and go, watching early morning fishermen and late-night sailors, watching the tide rise and fall. Robert Anderson appeared in frame at 2317 and never appeared again. It was as if he'd walked to the end of one of those piers and simply stepped off the edge of the earth. The Nassau Police Marine Area Command deployed divers into Middle Harbor on March 12th. The water was cold for autumn, the visibility poor despite the relatively calm conditions. The divers worked in shifts, descending along the seawall near where Robert was last seen, their lights cutting through the murky green darkness, illuminating startled fish and curious cuttlefish, but nothing human. They found shopping trolleys and lost anchors, and the corroded remains of a motorcycle someone had dumped decades ago. They found fishing line tangled around submerged pylons, and plastic bags caught in the rocks. They did not find Robert Anderson. Helen came to the marina on the second day of the search, standing behind the police barricade with Emma beside her, both of them watching the dive team's support boat moving slowly across the water. Sophie had wanted to come too, but Helen had refused, unable to articulate why she felt her younger daughter shouldn't witness this particular horror. Emma held her mother's hand the way she had as a small child, before adolescence had created distance between them, and together they watched strangers search the harbor for Robert's body, a body that wasn't there, a man who'd walked toward the water and vanished as completely as if the sea he'd loved had finally claimed him for its own. The digital forensics team from the New South Wales Police Force Cybercrime Squad arrived at the Anderson home on March 15th, a week after Robert's disappearance. Carrying equipment that looked more suited to a surgical theater than a suburban house, Helen watched them work from the doorway of Robert's office. This small room that had always been his sanctuary, where he'd spent countless hours studying weather patterns and maritime regulations, where he'd video called home from ports in Auckland and Noumea and Fiji. The lead technician, a woman in her 30s named Sarah Brennan, handled Robert's laptop with gloved hands, explaining in gentle tones that they needed to examine every file, every email, every keystroke that might explain where he'd gone and why. The laptop yielded its secrets slowly over the following 48 hours. Robert had been meticulous about digital security, using encrypted email services and password managers that required multiple authentication steps. The forensics team eventually bypassed these protections through methods Sarah Brennan didn't explain in detail, and what they found opened new corridors of questions that led away from the simple tragedy of a missing man into something darker and more complex. There were emails, dozens of them, exchanged over the past 6 months between Robert and someone using the name N. Harding. The messages were brief, cryptic, carefully worded to reveal nothing specific to anyone who might intercept them. References to the situation we discussed and what happened that night, and making sure the truth stays buried. Detective Clark brought Nicholas Harding in for questioning on March 18th. He arrived at the police station in Manly with a lawyer, a polished man in his early 50s who'd spent 22 years in the Royal Australian Navy before taking early references to the situation we discussed and what happened that night, and making sure the truth stays buried. Detective Clark brought Nicholas Harding in for questioning on March 18th. He arrived at the police station in Manly with a lawyer, a polished man in his early 50s who'd spent 22 years in the Royal Australian Navy before taking early retirement in 2017. His service record was exemplary, decorated for his work in maritime security operations throughout Southeast Asia. He'd known Robert Anderson for almost 15 years. He explained, their paths crossing repeatedly in Sydney's tight-knit maritime community. They'd served together on a naval exercise in 2008, had maintained occasional contact afterward, professional acquaintances who might have a beer together when their schedules aligned, but who weren't particularly close friends. The emails suggested otherwise. The forensics team had recovered messages dating back to September 2020, increasing in frequency through the pandemic months when Robert had been grounded and Nicholas had been working administrative duties at maritime voyages, the same company that employed Robert as captain. The tone of the correspondence was tense, almost threatening in places, though the specific threats remained maddeningly vague. In one message from January 2021, Nicholas had written, "We both know what's at stake here. The families deserve better than lies." Robert's response sent 3 hours later, "I've done everything you asked. Leave it alone." Another exchange from February was even more ominous. "Nicholas, I can't keep quiet forever. Someone needs to answer for what happened. Robert, you'll destroy everything. Think about what you're risking." Nicholas Harding sat across from Detective Clark in the interview room, his posture military straight, his expression carefully neutral. He confirmed he'd sent the emails, but refused to elaborate on their content. Attorney-client privilege, his lawyer interjected, whenever Clark pressed for specifics. What situation were they discussing? What had happened? What truth needed to stay buried? Nicholas stared at the table between them and said nothing useful. He claimed he didn't know Robert was missing until police contacted him. He hadn't made any phone calls to Robert on March 8th or any other recent date. He had nothing to do with whatever had happened at the marina. His alibi for that night was simple and unverifiable. He'd been home alone, watching television, the mundane routine of a divorced man living by himself in a neutral bay apartment. The police searched his apartment anyway, finding nothing incriminating beyond more evidence of a solitary existence. Takeaway containers in the bin, a made bed, a neat kitchen. They seized his phone and laptop, finding the same encrypted emails already recovered from Robert's computer. But nothing additional. No smoking gun, no confession hidden in draft folders or deleted files. Nicholas had been careful or perhaps genuinely innocent, the distinction impossible to determine from the available evidence. Helen read transcripts of the emails that Detective Clark deemed appropriate to share, sitting at her kitchen table with the pages spread before her like tarot cards, promising revelation but delivering only obscurity. She didn't recognize this version of her husband. This man who'd been keeping secrets and exchanging cryptic messages with a former naval officer about situations and truths that remained stubbornly undefined. Robert had been home during those months, working from his office, having dinner with the family, helping the girls with homework. He'd seemed stressed at times, but never frightened, never desperate enough to warrant the urgency she now detected in these printed words. The name, Trevor Blackwood, first appeared in Maritime Voyages incident reports, dated October 23, 2019, a document that took investigators 3 weeks to uncover buried in the company's archived safety files. The report was brief, almost dismissive in its clinical language. A 34-year-old male passenger had been found missing from the Pacific Explorer during an overnight crossing from Sydney to Wellington. Extensive searches of the vessel had been conducted. Security footage showed the subject on the starboard observation deck at approximately 2:17 in the morning, alone, leaning against the railing. The footage showed him there for 11 minutes before he climbed over the railing and dropped into the dark water 7 decks below. The ship had been traveling at 22 knots, despite immediate man-overboard protocols. Despite deploying rescue boats and coordinating with maritime rescue services, despite searching for 6 hours through increasingly rough seas, Trevor Blackwood's body was never recovered. The official finding was suicide. The report included statements from the ship's captain, Robert Anderson, describing the deceased as appearing intoxicated earlier in the evening, withdrawn and uncommunicative when approached by concerned crew members. A cabin steward reported finding empty vodka bottles in Blackwood's stateroom. The ship's doctor noted that Blackwood had declined medical attention when offered earlier that day, claiming he was fine despite appearing visibly distressed. The evidence painted a picture of a troubled man who'd made a tragic decision in the middle of the ocean, a narrative that maritime voyages had accepted without extensive investigation, and that Australian authorities had processed as a routine maritime fatality. Trevor Blackwood's family had never accepted this conclusion. His sister Sarah had filed complaints with the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, demanding a more thorough investigation. She'd contacted journalists, appearing in several newspaper articles published in late 2019 and early 2020, insisting that her brother hadn't been suicidal, that he'd been excited about the trip, that something else must have happened aboard that ship. The stories had gained little traction. A man going overboard on a cruise ship, tragic as it was, happened with unfortunate regularity, without evidence suggesting foul play, without witnesses contradicting the suicide narrative. Sarah's protests had faded into the background noise of maritime incidents that occurred and were forgotten. Detective Clark sat in Sarah Blackwood's apartment in Newtown on March 22nd, drinking instant coffee and listening to a woman who'd spent 18 months carrying grief and suspicion in equal measure. Sarah was 39, a social worker who specialized in adolescent mental health, someone trained to recognize depression and suicidal ideation in others. Her brother had shown none of those signs, she insisted. Trevor had been a financial auditor, meticulous and cautious by nature, planning to propose to his girlfriend when he returned from the cruise. He'd booked the trip as a celebration after completing a difficult work project, something about maritime contract audits that Sarah admitted she hadn't fully understood. Trevor had called her from the ship the day before he died, excited about seeing Wellington, talking about the food and the entertainment, and how he'd spent the afternoon in the ship's library working on some documents he'd brought along. The documents. Sarah had kept everything from Trevor's apartment after he'd been declared dead: his laptop, his files, boxes of paperwork that she'd been unable to bring herself to sort through. Detective Clark asked to see them, and Sarah led her to a spare bedroom that had become a shrine to unanswered questions. The laptop required forensic examination, but the paperwork was immediately illuminating. Trevor Blackwood had been investigating irregularities in maritime service contracts, specifically those involving port facilities and cruise ship maintenance agreements. His notes referenced maritime voyages by name, highlighting discrepancies between reported costs and actual expenditures, suggesting systematic inflation of service charges and possible kickback schemes involving company executives and Port Authority officials. The numbers were substantial. Trevor's calculations suggested maritime voyages had been overbilling for port services across multiple Australian harbors, inflating costs by approximately 30 to 40% and pocketing the difference through shell companies registered in Singapore and the Cayman Islands. The scheme had apparently been running for at least 3 years, potentially longer, generating millions in fraudulent profits. Trevor's notes indicated he'd planned to present his findings to the Australian Securities and Investments Commission after the cruise, that he'd brought copies of key documents with him as backup in case something happened to the files stored at his office. Those documents had never been recovered from Trevor's cabin. Maritime Voyagers had shipped his belongings to Sarah weeks after his death, but the work files he'd described in their final phone conversation weren't among them. Just clothes and toiletries and a book he'd been reading, nothing suggesting the elaborate financial investigation he'd been conducting. Sarah had assumed the documents had gone overboard with her brother, lost to the sea along with his body, and had never thought to question their absence until now. Linda Chambers had lived in the same waterfront apartment overlooking Spit Bridge Marina for 32 years, long enough to recognize the rhythms of the harbor, the comings and goings of boats and their owners, the way light changed across the water with the seasons. She'd been widowed in 2014 and had developed insomnia in the years since, spending long nights on her balcony with a cup of chamomile tea and a mystery novel, watching the marina below like a silent guardian of other people's midnight activities. She'd seen proposals and arguments, teenagers sneaking onto boats for places to drink, fishermen departing before dawn. The marina had become her television, providing endless human drama played out in miniature beneath her 6th-floor vantage point. She'd seen Robert Anderson arrive on the night of March 8th. Though she hadn't known his name at the time, hadn't understood the significance of what she was witnessing. The police appeal for information hadn't reached her until March 19th, when her daughter visited and mentioned the missing cruise ship captain, showing her mother the news article on her phone. Linda had felt something shift in her memory, a detail rising to the surface like debris from a sunken ship. She'd called the police tip line that afternoon, her hands shaking as she dialed, uncertain whether what she'd seen mattered but feeling compelled to share it anyway. Detective Clark arrived at Linda's apartment on March 20th, with a younger constable named James Wright, both of them settling into the floral-patterned armchairs Linda's late husband had picked out decades ago. Linda served them tea in china cups and recounted what she'd witnessed from her balcony 11 days earlier. She'd been reading that night, unable to sleep as usual, when she'd noticed a car entering the marina parking area around 11:20. The man who emerged had walked quickly toward the piers, hands in his pockets, his posture suggesting tension rather than the relaxed gait of someone heading out for a late-night sail. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. People kept irregular schedules at marinas, but then perhaps 10 minutes later, she'd noticed movement on Pier C, the furthest pier from the main entrance. Two figures standing close together near the end, where the larger sailing yachts were berthed. The marina's lighting was poor in that section, just a few overhead lamps creating pools of yellow illumination, separated by long stretches of shadow. Linda had watched the two men talking, their body language suggesting intensity even from her distant vantage point. One man gestured emphatically, his arm movements sharp and aggressive. The other stood very still, almost rigid. They'd spoken for several minutes before both disappeared from her line of sight behind a yacht's cabin, and Linda had lost interest, returning to her book. She'd identified Robert Anderson from the photographs Detective Clark showed her. Though she admitted the distance and poor lighting made absolute certainty impossible, the other man was harder to describe. Taller than Robert by perhaps 3 or 4 inches, she thought. Broader through the shoulders. He'd worn dark clothing, possibly a jacket, possibly just a heavy shirt. Linda remembered his hair caught the light at one point, appearing gray or white, suggesting someone middle-aged or older. Beyond these vague details, she could offer little else. No distinguishing features, no visible tattoos or scars. Nothing that would help identify him among Sydney's population of several million. Detective Clark arranged for Linda to undergo cognitive interview techniques and eventually hypnosis, controversial methods that defense lawyers often challenged in court, but which occasionally yielded useful information. The hypnosis session took place on March 24th at a clinical office in North Sydney, conducted by Dr. Patricia Morrison, a forensic psychologist who specialized in witness recall. Linda sat in a reclining chair with her eyes closed. "Doctor," Morrison's voice guiding her back to that night, reconstructing the scene with painstaking detail. What had she heard? What had she smelled? What had drawn her attention to the pier in the first place? Under hypnosis, Linda's memory became sharper, or perhaps simply more detailed. The distinction between genuine recall and unconscious fabrication, always uncertain with these techniques. She remembered hearing voices carrying across the water, indistinct words transformed into rhythm and tone by distance. She remembered one voice rising, angry or frightened. She couldn't determine which. She remembered a single word cutting through the night air, clearly enough to reach her balcony. Testimony. The word had registered because it seemed oddly formal, legalistic, out of place in a marina at midnight. She remembered the two men standing very close together at one point, almost confrontationally before one of them stepped back. Then they'd moved behind the yacht and she'd lost sight of them completely. Detective Clark pressed for more details. Which man had said testimony? Which one had stepped back? Linda's face creased with concentration beneath closed eyelids, searching memory that might not exist for answers she desperately wanted to provide. She thought the taller man had spoken the word. She thought Robert had been the one to step back, but she couldn't be certain. Couldn't swear to it in court. Couldn't distinguish between what she'd actually witnessed and what her mind was now constructing to fill the gaps. When Dr. Morrison brought her out of hypnosis, Linda was exhausted and frustrated, feeling she'd failed somehow to provide the crucial detail that would solve everything. The Australian Federal Police Financial Crimes Division had been investigating maritime voyages for irregularities in government contract bidding since September 2020, a fact that Detective Clark learned only after Trevor Blackwood's name appeared in connection with Robert Anderson's disappearance. The investigation had been proceeding slowly, hampered by the complexity of maritime financial regulations and the company's sophisticated use of offshore entities to obscure money flows. Senior investigator Marcus Thompson had been leading the probe with a small team, following paper trails through Singapore banking records and Cayman Islands shell corporations, building a case that required absolute precision before any charges could be filed. Thompson met with Clark at AFP headquarters in Sydney on March 26th, spreading documents across a conference table that told a story of systematic corruption spanning at least 5 years. Maritime Voyages had been inflating costs for port services and maintenance contracts, submitting false invoices to government maritime authorities, and pocketing the difference through a network of subsidiary companies that existed primarily on paper. The scheme was elegant in its simplicity and brazen in its scale. Every time one of Maritime Voyages' cruise ships docked at an Australian port, the company billed the government for services rendered, security provided, waste management performed. The actual costs were substantially lower than the invoiced amounts, with the excess flowing to offshore accounts controlled by senior executives. Trevor Blackwood had stumbled onto this scheme while conducting a routine audit for his employer, a mid-sized accounting firm that specialized in maritime industry clients. He'd noticed discrepancies in maintenance records, costs that didn't align with industry standards, payments to vendors that seemed inflated or unnecessary. Being thorough by nature, he dug deeper, following trails that led him to suspect something far larger than simple accounting errors. He documented his findings meticulously, building a case that would have exposed Maritime Voyages' fraud if he'd lived to present it. Instead, he'd gone overboard in the middle of the Tasman Sea, his evidence disappearing with him. The AFP had known about Trevor Blackwood's death, had even questioned whether it might be connected to their investigation, but without his documentation, and without clear evidence of foul play, they'd been unable to pursue that angle. Maritime Voyages had conducted an internal investigation that found nothing suspicious, and the company's lawyers had been aggressive in threatening legal action against anyone suggesting the death was anything other than a tragic suicide. The investigation had continued without Blackwood's evidence, slower and more difficult, relying on subpoenaed bank records and interviews with lower-level employees who knew fragments of the scheme, but not its full scope. Robert Anderson's name had appeared in the investigation peripherally, identified as the captain aboard the Pacific Explorer when Blackwood died. But he'd never been considered a suspect or even a significant witness. His statement about the incident had been straightforward, showing no signs of deception or evasion. The AFP had no reason to believe he was involved in the financial crimes they were investigating, but the encrypted emails between Robert and Nicholas Harding suggested otherwise, implied both men knew something about Blackwood's death that contradicted the official suicide narrative, carried knowledge that had festered between them for 18 months, until Robert disappeared into the same darkness that had swallowed Trevor Blackwood. Nicholas Harding's connection to Maritime Voyages deepened the complexity. After retiring from the Navy in 2017, he'd taken a position as security consultant for the cruise line, advising on anti-piracy measures and emergency protocols. The position was part-time, allowing him to maintain other consulting contracts, but it placed him inside the company during the period when the fraud was most active. His access would have given him insight into operations that few others possessed, the ability to see patterns and irregularities that might escape notice from those less trained in surveillance and security analysis. Whether he'd been complicit in the fraud or had discovered it independently remained unclear, but his emails to Robert suggested he knew exactly what had happened to Trevor Blackwood and why. Detective Clark obtained warrants to access Harding's financial records, finding nothing obviously suspicious but several deposits from offshore accounts that couldn't be immediately traced to legitimate sources. The amounts weren't enormous, $20,000 here, $15,000 there, spread across 2 years in irregular intervals that might suggest consulting fees or might. She mentioned Nicholas Harding specifically, describing how he'd frequently visited the finance department, reviewing security expenditure reports with a level of detail that had seemed excessive for a part-time consultant. She'd overheard conversations between Harding and the company's CEO, Gerald Thompson, conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the room, creating atmospheres of tension and secrecy that had made her increasingly uneasy. The AFP moved quickly once Jennifer Walsh provided her testimony, coordinating with New South Wales police to execute simultaneous raids on Maritime Voyages headquarters and the private residences of 3 senior executives on November 4, 2021. The operation began at dawn, Dozens of officers moving through the circular key offices with warrants authorizing seizure of computers, documents, and any materials related to financial operations spanning the previous 7 years. Gerald Thompson, 59 years old and CEO of Maritime Voyages since 2014, was arrested at his harborside apartment in Kirribilli, still in pajamas when officers knocked on his door at 6:17 that morning. His shock appeared genuine, or perhaps simply well performed, protesting his innocence even as forensic accountants began cataloging evidence that would ultimately prove his guilt. Patricia Brennan, 54, the company's chief financial officer, was arrested at her office where she'd apparently arrived early, perhaps warned by someone within the company that something was coming, perhaps simply maintaining her usual workaholic schedule. She said nothing to the arresting officers, invoking her right to legal counsel immediately, her face composed in an expression of careful neutrality that suggested someone accustomed to hiding emotions behind professional masks. Her computers yielded thousands of documents detailing the fraud scheme's mechanics, spreadsheets tracking payments to offshore accounts, communications with shell company representatives that removed any doubt about the deliberate nature of the crimes. Nicholas Harding was arrested at his Neutral Bay apartment, and unlike the others, he seemed almost relieved when officers informed him of the charges. He'd been living with knowledge that had poisoned him from within, carrying secrets that had cost lives, watching Robert Anderson disappear and knowing exactly why it had happened, but unable to speak without destroying himself. His arrest provided strange liberation, permission to finally tell the truth even as that truth would imprison him. He'd been part of the scheme initially, he admitted during his first interview after arrest, recruited by Thompson to help obscure the security consulting payments that formed part of the fraud structure. But he'd grown uncomfortable as the scheme expanded. Had tried to extract himself, had threatened to expose everything if Thompson didn't shut down the operation. That's when Trevor Blackwood had become a problem. The auditor had been getting too close,